Hi guys. I am just going to do a short lecture to finish up the muscle notes, and then look on Top Hat for a quiz that will include both muscle that we have been working on and also a little bit of the material that we're going to work on Tuesday. So it's open note. You can use whatever resources you want to get the questions right. It is mostly muscle and a little bit of the autonomic nervous system. So expect that to be open and available later today. You don't have to get it done today, though. Um, you actually have until the day before your test to get it done. Okay, so the last thing that I want to talk about is just how skeletal muscle behaves when you exercise. So the thing that doesn't happen, with very few exceptions, is that you do not get any appreciable number of more skeletal muscle fibers after adulthood, because during embryonic development, mitosis is occurring, and you have all of these small uninucleated cells. They're called myoblasts, they're precursor to muscle cells. But during embryonic development, after they go through cell division, they actually fuse into these multinucleated skeletal muscle fibers that you're used to seeing, right? And so after they're multinucleated and fused, and the process of fusion is called syncytium, you don't get any more cell division. So take home message there is that you really don't get any more muscle fibers after embryonic development. So um, at birth, you're going to have pretty much all the muscle fibers you're ever going to have. Now, there are a few muscle stem cells, but very, very few. You could get very few more muscle cells. Okay, so how can you increase the size of a whole muscle, and what types of activity would cause that to occur? Well, it's kind of what you would think. I mean, from working out or from hearing about somebody else working out, that if you want to increase muscle mass, if you want to increase the size of a whole muscle, there are certain types of activity that you do. If you want to increase muscle tone, there's different types of activity that you do. So in an adult, muscles will what's called hypertrophy only if you use them at about 75% of the maximum tension that they can generate. So this is strength training. This is high weight, low rep training, meaning that you wouldn't be able to lift whatever this is 25 times if you were at 75% of your maximum tension. Now, if you were an elite athlete, they could actually calculate your maximum tension. But with a normal human, what they generally do is say, okay, if you can do 8 reps, less than 10 reps, and you're pretty much worn out, you're probably around there. Now, the number changes a little bit. And then, of course, as you get stronger, you'd have to recalculate it anyway. So what happens when you do that kind of activity is, the way that I think of it is, you are communicating with your muscle, and what you are telling your muscle by lifting something repeatedly that's almost at the limits of your strength capacity, you are telling your muscle that I need you to be stronger in the future. And so what will happen if you do that type of activity, that strength training activity, is that during rest periods, assuming that you have adequate protein in your diet for amino acids, adequate amounts of ATP, what will happen is you have just told your muscles and created small little damages in your muscles that says, hey, you're not adequate to this task. And so what you will do is you will do protein synthesis during your rest periods. You will increase the number of actin and myosin filaments. You'll increase the number of myofibrils in each fiber, but you don't increase the number of fibers. And of course, since the type of behavior that you're doing is mostly lifting something up and putting it down relatively quickly, you're not, for instance, doing this for an hour and a half, you're doing it for a few minutes, then what you get disproportionately is mostly white fibers are going to be responding. Remember that those are the bigger fibers, and they will enlarge, and you'll get more fast glycolytic fibers. So basically, you're training yourself to be more white meat. So they make ATP anaerobically, but they're large and they're strong. They don't have a whole lot of myoglobin. And of course, if you're doing this type of activity, only a few contractions at a time are necessary or even possible. In addition, you've heard many, many times that if you want to build muscle mass, you should work out a group for strength training one day and then leave it alone. Um, that's because if you work it out in the same way the next day, instead of using that ATP for anabolic activity to build muscle mass, you'll be using that ATP for muscle contraction. So if you want to build muscle mass, you have to work out a muscle group to 75% maximum tension, not every day, because muscles will actually grow and do their protein synthesis during rest and recovery. Okay, so the other extreme of muscle activity is relatively weaker activity, far less than 75% maximum tension, but over longer periods of time. And if you do relatively weaker activity, even if you do it for a long period of time, it's not going to get you significant hypertrophy. Meaning that, for instance, if you are a cyclist, you are not going to get the same amount of muscle mass in your legs that, for instance, a weightlifter would. So this kind of long duration, relatively low intensity. So now we're doing low weight, high rep. That results in disproportionately different types of fibers being trained. So the red fibers, for instance, the slow oxidative, but not exclusively slow oxidative, those are going to be the ones that would respond disproportionately. And they make ATP primarily aerobically. And so when you use those, then what happens over time is you develop more capillaries, you develop more myoglobin in each fiber and more mitochondria in each fiber. And the result is greater muscle tone and greater endurance and fatigue resistance when oxygen is available. Luckily, when you do this type of activity, simultaneous to training your muscles, you are also training your cardiovascular and respiratory system. So even though the muscle mass increases in tone, the muscle size may decrease slightly. So you're not going to become hypertrophic like this dude that I showed you guys. Sorry, I forgot to bring him up. That guy. So if you do aerobic activity, you are not going to look like this. Okay. That is not how that type of activity. This probably had a lot of testosterone involved too, but so the muscle size may decrease slightly. Now, it's not necessarily decreasing in mass, but it actually, because of the tone, it may actually look like it's slightly smaller. And of course, this produces beneficial changes in the respiratory and cardiovascular system. So if you want to both increase muscle mass and also increase duration or fatigue resistance, you'd have to do both kinds of training. Now, as we age, what happens is the maximum force that you can generate with a muscle will decrease between 30 and 40%, and that starts in your 30s, and of course goes until you die, but let's just say between 30 and 80. Primarily what's happening is the use it or lose it principle. Your fibers will decrease in diameter because if I don't need as much tensile strength and I'm not doing as much with my body, then as for instance I break down actin or myosin, I just don't actually replace it. And a lot of this loss can be prevented by exercise. So it's not like a sentence that everyone loses muscle mass at 30, because you can certainly have more at 30 than you did at 20. But the predisposition is that activity levels will decrease as you age a little bit. So what if I ever damage a skeletal muscle fiber? What happens since they're amitotic? Well, what happens is if I damage the skeletal muscle fiber, I don't usually damage all of the nuclei. So what I would usually do is damage part of a cell, and then the rest of the cell can still be alive. If, however, you damage the entire skeletal muscle fiber, you can't go through cell division, and you will replace that muscle tissue with scar tissue. That process is called fibrosis. This is possible. There's a teeny amount of skeletal muscle fiber division possible because of these stem cells called satellite cells. They're satellite cells, and they can make just a few skeletal muscle fibers. But for instance, if you had some kind of disorder, like let's say a brown recluse bite that actually kills off tissue in a big region, what would happen is you would get a few back because of satellite cells, but you would lose the vast majority of them, and it would be replaced by scar tissue. Okay, so now let's just do a little bit of comparison contrast to smooth muscle tissue and to cardiac muscle. Oh, I didn't do cardiac in this one. So cardiac muscle we'll do when we do the heart. Okay, so now let's just compare smooth and skeletal. Well, you guys remember from anatomy, I'm sure, that smooth muscle is called smooth because it's not striated. Cardiac muscle is also striated, and we'll see that there's a lot of similarities between how skeletal and cardiac muscle are arranged in their actin and myosin. But let's talk about smooth muscle for a second. So it's non-striated, it's involuntary, it's controlled by the autonomic nervous system or the involuntary division of the efferent nervous system, which is the next set of notes. And it does contain actin and myosin, but since the muscle myofilaments don't line up, they don't make striations. So even though there's a similar sort of contraction mechanism, you don't have striations. The cells individually are like, they call them spindle shaped, but nobody knows what a spindle looks like. They look like an eyeball, long and skinny, but narrower on the ends than in the middle. And most smooth muscle actually has the ability to divide even into adulthood. So, for instance, you could have abdominal surgery and they could slice into your stomach or an intestine, and the smooth muscle that you damaged has the capacity for regeneration. Now, smooth muscle compared to skeletal muscle, the rate of cross-bridge cycling is slower, which means that you use less energy. It also means that it's not as responsive. And in addition, the calcium pumps on the SR are also slower, which means for every calcium release, you get a longer contraction. You also store less calcium in the SR. So you release it and then it stays there and you've got a slower rate of cross-bridge cycling. So I'm not super responsive, but I can last for a decently long time. So the strength of contractions is similar, but smooth muscle is much better able to maintain a sustained contraction. And in addition, smooth muscle, unlike skeletal muscle, can contract really well when it's stretched. So the smooth muscle in the wall of your stomach, for instance, or in the wall of the uterus, can actually contract when it's stretched to 2 to 8 times its original length. So this is really good for getting things to move through hollow organs. Okay, so now, smooth muscle, unlike skeletal muscle, has multiple motivations for contraction. Skeletal muscle in normal situations will contract when the somatic nervous system tells it to. With smooth muscle, it has both an inherent depolarization that will make it contract, and in addition, it also can be stimulated by the nervous system and hormones and paracrine agents and stretch. So let's look at each of these. So smooth muscle, unlike skeletal muscle, has spontaneous electrical activity. It has these cells in it that are pacemaker cells. And what they do is they spontaneously depolarize. And when they do that, they will generate an action potential. So this is what the pacemaker action potential looks like in certain forms of smooth muscle. So the resting membrane potential is set a little bit higher. But it's really never stable at resting membrane potential. What they'll do is they'll slowly depolarize to threshold, which is at about minus 50 in this particular smooth muscle. Then they'll get an action potential and then they'll repolarize. But notice they'll slowly depolarize again, action potential, repolarize. Cardiac muscle does something similar. So they have this spontaneous depolarization. And this happens in the absence of the nervous system stimulating them at all. So this gives this pacemaker contraction, which in the digestive system can result in peristaltic contraction. Okay, so they have their own inherent depolarization, and they're going to contract even if the nervous system doesn't tell them what to do. So now what can the nervous system tell them to do? The nervous system can tell them to contract more quickly or more slowly. So although it looks weird, this is actually synapses with smooth muscle. So the autonomic nervous system, sometimes called the visceral motor division, can actually actively stimulate or actively inhibit smooth muscle activity. So for instance, with skeletal muscle, you either stimulate it and get it closer to a contraction or make it contract, or you just leave it alone. But what I'm telling you is with smooth muscle, you can either actively speed it up or actively slow it down. So we will get into that in the next set of notes as well. And then the other thing is that with smooth muscle, in addition to spontaneous electrical activity and nervous system being able to control it, smooth muscle is also sensitive to hormonal stimulation. So, for instance, estrogen can actually cause uterine wall contraction. Stress hormones can cause digestive system upset that can give you diarrhea, for instance. So, hormones can increase or decrease the activity of smooth muscle. And then paracrine agents, your stomach actually releases different paracrine agents when it's empty than it does when it's full. And the ones that it releases when it's full will make it contract, and the ones it releases when it's empty will actually inhibit contraction. And then the last thing is that stretch alone can be a motivation for smooth muscle contraction. So your stomach is full and it's stretched in the wall, and that stretch can actually cause contraction. Okay, and then the last thing in this set of notes is just the two different categories of smooth muscle, and they're right here in this picture. So if you look here, we've got smooth muscle cells, and I told you it looks weird, but this is actually how you form these synaptic terminals. They're actually called varicosities. So it looks weird, but this is actually the end of some axons, and the neurotransmitters are stored there. But please note that in the top picture, every single smooth muscle cell has the nervous system talking to it. And then in the bottom picture, you will see that you only talk to a few, and they will actually tell their friends the message through gap junctions. So let's talk about these two different categories of smooth muscle. The one that's most familiar to people is the second one, which is called visceral or single unit smooth muscle. This is the one that people usually refer to. It has peristaltic waves of contraction. I don't have to stimulate every single one because they'll actually give each other the message. You find them in the stomach, the intestines, the bladder, the uterus, and they are called single unit because they behave as a single unit, right? And it's gap junctions that allow the action potential to move from cell to cell after you get it started in the first cell. Okay, these are usually sensitive to stretch. They tend to depolarize spontaneously because of pacemaker cells, and these are the ones that are most likely to be affected by hormones and stuff. But there is a different kind of smooth muscle that you can control the cells individually, and that's called multi-unit smooth muscle. And put this together in your head. This one behaves like a single unit, and this one behaves like multiple individual units, so multi-unit. So the multi-unit smooth muscle, you can control each one individually. Each individual cell has its own nerve supply from the autonomic division of the nervous system, and the impulse doesn't go from cell to cell. There are no gap junctions. And so you find this one in areas in which you want to be able to make teeny tiny little changes in smooth muscle. Like in the smooth muscle that is controlling the diameter of the wall of your arteries and arterioles. We don't want an entire artery or arteriole to constrict. We want to constrict it, for instance, at a junction point to change blood flow patterns. The walls of your bronchioles, bronchium, bronchioles, the smooth muscle controlling the diameter of your pupil, and the erector pili muscles in your skin. Those are controlled with individual cells instead of like a whole sheet of cells. Okay, so that is that, and I will upload